I'm Melissa from the Yarn Barn, and today let's look at those numbers that come before a yarn name or as part of a yarn name, because they can give you a little bit of information about the yarn itself. So let's talk first a little bit about the history and where those numbers come from, and then we'll look at some examples. So we're talking about numbers like 3/2 pearl cotton, 8/2 cotton, or 16/2 linen. These are all numbers that impart information about the thickness of the yarn and how it's made. So in the US, we do it a little bit differently from the rest of the world, of course, but in the US, the first number indicates the thickness of the ply. The second number indicates how many of those plies are there. Now let's look back at that first number. The number that comes before the slash is like gauge on a wire. So the bigger the number, the finer the ply. And then again, the second number tells you how many of those plies there are. Now, the origin of these numbers comes from the early days of textile manufacturing, where guilds controlled production and they wanted to make the yarns uniform. So they wanted to know that in one city, the wool production in England they would be making yarn that would be similar to this yarn that's being produced in a different part of the country, because they were using this numbering system that would make things standard. So let's look at how they generated these numbers, or what they mean. So for example, in cotton, a number 1 cotton is 840 yards in a pound. So a single ply that weighs a pound, you would have 840 yards in that pound. So that's the beginning point. Now, if you wanted a thinner strand and you used basically half the diameter, you would have twice the length, and that would be a number 2. Similarly, if you, in reference to that number one count, if you did a number 3, it would be a third the size, but 3 times the length, all in a pound. So you can see that as that number is getting bigger, you're getting more yards in a pound, and the yarn itself is getting finer. And then that second number again tells you how many plies are twisted together. It doesn't really tell you how they're twisted together, what method of twisting, if it's tightly twisted or loosely twisted. It just tells you how many plies there are. Now, I mentioned that in the US, we do it differently from the rest of the world. And that the rest of the world does a reverse. So the first number is the number of plies. The second number is that relative number that tells you how big the ply is. So you have to take numbers like that in context. So if you see a yarn described as a 2/8, but it seems like it's probably a yarn that you would use for a towel, and it looks like the source might be Canada, for example, then just know that, oh yeah, that's right, outside the country, they're swapped. So one other thing to keep in mind is that we talked about the cotton standard, 840 yards per pound. To make it tricky, or each different fiber has its own count. So linen is 300 yards per pound. That's a number 1. Or with worsted wool, 560 yards makes a number 1. So you can't compare an 8/2 cotton to an 8/2 wool and think they're going to be the same. That's where you really need to rely on yardage per pound that might be given with information about the yarn to make decisions about set or using things together, hoping for a similar size. Let's look at some examples, and it might make it a little bit more clear. So let's look at some examples that are all cotton. So these are 16/2, 8/2, 4/2, 8/4, and 8/16 cottons. And let's compare. So let's look at the finest one first. So it's a 16/2. That 16 tells us that it is a fine ply, and the 2 tells us that we've got 2 plies. Now let's jump over here to the 8/2 and compare them. So this one has 2 plies as well, but you can see how much thicker this ply is compared to this one. In fact, this is twice the thickness of that one, and we know that because 16 is twice 8. So this one is half the size of this one, both in the ply and then the overall yarn, because they have 2 plies in each yarn. Now let's jump up one more size. So this is 4-2, and it is twice the size of the 8-2. And you can see really noticeably, again, these are all 2 plies, so it's got 2 plies, but you can see how much beefier this ply is compared to this one. It's a little bit loosely plied or loosely twisted, so it maybe looks like it's got more volume than it does, but this one is twice the thickness of this, or has twice the fiber of that. Now this is an interesting comparison because these 2 yarns are basically the same size. They have the same yardage per pound, but they're made differently. And that's something that these numbers tell you. So this one tells you that it's a 2 ply, but of a 4 count. And this tells you that it's 4 plies of an 8 count. And so yardage wise, they're the same, 1,680 yards per pound, but this one is made with these 4 finer plies, and this one is made with 2 thicker plies, but overall they're about the same weight. And then this final one is a really heavy yarn, but it's made of all of these fine plies. This is made of the same ply size as this one, but here there's 16 of them, and so that's how you get such a heavy yarn. And then so if we just look at these yardages, 16-2 has 6,720 yards per pound. 8-2 has half of that, and that's because this yarn is twice as thick, so the yardage is half. And then we do the exact same kind of stair step. This one, again, the yarn is twice as thick as that, so the yardage is half of what that one was. These are made differently, but they're the same yardage. And then this bulky guy is basically the equivalent of 8 of these together. And so this yardage per pound is an 1/8 of what that is. So the numbers you can see kind of are very logical. You just have to know 2 things: the country where the yarn originated and the fiber, before you start making these comparisons. Now, here's an example of why you can't compare yarns of different fibers and think that the numbers will help you. So this is a 16-2 cotton. You can see how fine it is. That was the first one we looked at on the previous sheet. Here's a 16-2 linen, and you can see how much heavier it is. They're both 2 plies, but this one's so much thicker because even though it has a 16 here and a 16 here, because the count was different on the linen. And so you're getting a much bulkier yarn here. So you couldn't take a pattern that's written for a 16-2 linen and just substitute 16-2 cotton without making changes to the pattern. And then similarly, here's an 8-2 cotton. It's a very typical yarn that you would see for, towels or something like that. Here's an 8-2 wool, so much heavier. And part of it is that it just is heavier. There's more fiber here, but also wool is kind of voluminous. It's got little fibers that come out, maybe in a way that's different from the cotton. So you would struggle if you took a pattern that was written for 8-2 wool and tried to use it with 8-2 cotton without making adjustments to the pattern. So not to get bogged down on the math, but you can calculate the yardage per pound approximately if you have those numbers. So if you know the count of the yarn. So for example, we talked about cotton is 840. So if you don't know the yardage per pound on a 16-2 cotton that you have, for example, and you're trying to calculate, you know how much the cone you have weighs, but you don't know how much yardage you have, for example. So it is pretty straightforward. Take that first number, the 16, multiply it by the count, and then divide it by the number of plies. So it would be 16 times 840 divided by 2, and that'll give you the yardage per pound. Now, I will say that there are yarns available today that use this numbering system that are kind of fudging a little bit. It's in the neighborhood, and for most applications, that's fine. We have a wool called Blue Mountain that's listed as a 8.2, or because it's from Canada, a 2.8. And it's within about 140 yards of what a 2.8 officially would be. So it's not exact, but if you were doing general calculations, it would at least give you a rough idea. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that not every yarn has this count. Yarn companies are free to design whatever kind of yarn they want, and there's no guild that's trying to enforce rules for conformity. So if you are finding a yarn that you like and you don't see that there's a number associated with it, use that yardage per pound as a comparison. An 8.2 that has 3,360 yards per pound and a mystery yarn that has 3,200 yards per pound, even though it doesn't have a number on it, you can say, oh yeah, those will work about the same if they're the same fiber. All right, so I hope now you feel more comfortable about plies and thickness of plies and how those numbers relate to the yarn that you're going to get. Thanks.